what are the ways that you think a volunteer that come into the prison as a missionary into the prison culture, what are ways that they can be most influential? Based on the book Redemption Through the Eyes of the Condemned, I decided to start a podcast to explain the different ways that we can see the gospel from the perspective of someone who is in chains.
We were blind like Saul, chained like Paul, fell but called. Hear the gospel as we live it in the pen. We the king's men. We, who no sin became sin. Like Paul and Silas we pray, singing praises to the Redeemer for his grace. Redemption through the eyes of the condemned. We going in. We, who knew no sin became sin. We were blind like Saul, chained like Paul, fell but called. Hear the gospel as we live it in the pen. We the king's men. We, who knew no sin became sin. Like Paul and Silas we pray, singing praises to the Redeemer for his grace. Redemption through the eyes of the condemned. We going in.
Hey everybody, this is Redemption Through the Eyes of the Condemned, and I'm your host, John Tanner. And today we're going to have an interview with an inmate that's incarcerated with a life sentence in Texas prison. He's currently on the Clemens unit in Brazoria, Texas. Me and him were field ministers together. We went to school together, we ministered together, we cried together, we had fun together, and we preached together in the streets of prison. There's a picture of him right here. So Cody and Julia, we're worthy people. This is the team. This is the team that I started with right here. Jason Karch, and Lawrence Birch Jr. Jason Karch and his wife. Jason Karch, precinct in Clemens unit. Jason Karch, and this is when I was there on the far right. And this is me, Jason Karch, my dad, and Terry Solly at visitation on the Darrington unit. Me and Jason have a lot of history together, but make no means about it, Jason Karch is an amazing theologian inside the prison. You know, one of the things that he always says is, hey man, whatever we say in prison, just because I'm incarcerated doesn't mean it don't have any substance. Just because we're locked up don't mean we ain't have a voice, that we can't say something that should be heard or deserves to be listened to. So Jason Karch has written 3 books, and we're going to go over one book. I'm going to interview him on that one book, Upon This Rock. And we're going to think about some of the things that you would want to think about in relationship to changing the culture of prison with the gospel. And so, can't wait to get started. Redemption Through the Eyes of the Condemned. This is John Tanner, your host.
An inmate at Clemens Unit. This call is being recorded and is subject to monitoring. To accept this free call, press 1. To refuse this free call, press 2. Thank you for using
Accepted.
Securus. You may start the conversation now.
All right, so here we are at Redemption Through the Eyes of the Condemned with our buddy here, Jason Karch. Go ahead and say hi, Jason.
What's up, my friend? You good?
Yes, I'm good, man. Let me see here. I'm going to turn you up, make sure the volume's loud. Here we go. We're going to go ahead and get into it, Jason.
Right on.
I'm going to control the volume up and down. Make sure that your microphone is at a good spot, or you're speaking not too close to it so it don't feedback or peak out on me. This is Jason Karch here, and that's not Jason Karch. Here it is. All right, let's start here. Me and Jason Karch met back in 2012 on the Darrington unit, where we were taking a seminary degree together for a bachelor's of science from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. When we graduated in 2016, him, I, Jesse Angiano, and LBJ, Lawrence Birch Jr., we all went to the Clemens unit. This was in 2016. Jason Karch is still there on the Clemens unit preaching right now, teaching classes, and being there as a helpful aid to those who are in need. But while he's doing all that, he's also writing books. And so Jason Karch has written 3 books thus far. And so, hey, Jason, I'm going to talk real quick before we get into the book of today. Here's The Hurt with Fetters, Theological Reflections on Criminal Justice. Jason, kind of give me like a little summary of that book.
Well, Hurt with Fetters is the first book, and what I try to do is I try to process criminal justice, the ideas of criminal justice theologically. You know, we have a lot of those theological institutions of the ideas surrounding criminal justice. What I try to do in that book is apply theology in particular to these ideas associated with criminal justice.
All right. So the book today that we're going to also review, I want to actually interview Jason on, is Upon This Rock, a groundwork for changing prison culture. And matter of fact, Jason Karch sent me the manuscript for this when I was still incarcerated, and I got to write one of those little blurbs in the front of it about it. I really like this book. It really testifies to the things that we witnessed down there, things that you could only know if you were incarcerated. Of course, you don't know the context of a place until you're within that context. And so that's the benefit of thinking about this book. Another thing that I thought was really important is that volunteers and ministries that come into the prisons should probably read a book like this so they can have a better impact in their ministry there with incarcerated. You know, whatever missions trip that churches are planning to do, you'll kind of want to know a little bit more how to be the most effective in that environment. So this book would be really good for missionaries and those who are considering prison as their ground for mission work. And so the last book that Jason Karch has written, if I'm wrong, correct me, but it's Among the Thorns, the making of a prison theologian. Give us a little brief summary of that.
Yeah, well, so, you know, on the heels of the first 2 books, you know, people began to ask the question, like, okay, well, you know, what is your story? You know, how did you get to the point where you were thinking about criminal justice in this way, thinking about prison culture in these ways? And so Among the Thorns is pretty much kind of my story. It's a memoir, if you will. And initially, when it comes to an idea of writing a memoir, I'm like, nah, man, that's not my thing. But then I listened to this writing workshop from a lady who, you know, helps people craft memoirs. She kind of cast memoirs in terms of making an argument for something. I'm like, well, I can do that. So that's kind of how Among the Thorns emerged.
All right. Yeah, that's great. And Jason, you're going to have to fix your phone. It's kind of hard to hear you, and then when I do hear you, it's rattling the speaker a little bit. Are you on your tablet phone?
Yeah, I'm on the tablet phone.
That's pretty good right there. Whatever you change, that's helpful.
I just got a little.
Cool. Well, it's not easy to be active in prison and write books. It's a very distracting place. It's not what you would think. It's not a very quiet and calming place, so it's very difficult. And I wrote my entire book in prison, and it took everything in me to stay focused sometimes and get it done. If it weren't for COVID in 2020, I don't think I'd ever got it done. So we'd have nothing to do in COVID. Jason, we got ourselves about 25 minutes, and what I want to start out with is why the book Upon This Rock. I just want to ask you why this book. What specifics can you tell me about the reason for that book?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First, you know, we mentioned Hurt with Fetters, and so that's kind of the highbrow technical stuff when it comes to processing issues concerning criminal justice. But with this book, it's more of a ground level, hands-on approach to what is going on inside the prison itself in reference to kind of how things work themselves out, in reference to Christian community, the role that gangs play in prison, all of that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that. You know, the more the application of your theology in work in inside the prison facility, right?
Yep.
Well, that's good. You know, so you know, we heard this 1,000 times in seminary. You know, the professors, Dr. Phillips that we had on here the other day, the dean there in Houston at the Harvard campus, Dr. Dean Autry. You know, him too. You know, they were over and over again. You know. Making sure we understood that it's about changing the culture. For many of us, we didn't really understand necessarily what they meant by that. How do you change a culture? What is a culture? So what is a prison culture? So those are the things that we often ask and try to figure out. And so, Jason, I know you've done this since you wrote the book on it. So what is prison culture to you?
Well, you know, that's the very thing you mentioned, how we were challenged in seminary that the objective of our seminary education was to go out and change prison culture. Well, nobody really ever took the time to explain to us exactly what that is and what change does that prison culture look like. So, you know, and I addressed that very issue in one of the chapters in the book. But I think by and large, you know, prison culture is shaped by the competition of power structures and this, you know, this implicit struggle for identity within, you know, individual prisons. You know, you know, Darren, you're incarcerated. Multiple, you know, prisons. You know, you kind of moved around a lot.
Yes.
You know, a lot of guys don't have that opportunity. And each prison, you know, kind of has its own little vibe. You know what I'm saying? Now, when you think about culture, there's one thing that's fixed, like the material culture of prison. You know, you got the razor wire, the cell doors, the uniforms, the guards. That's kind of the material culture of prison. But the thing that differs from one unit to another, from one prison to another, is what they call the adaptive culture, right?
Okay.
And both of those things have a particular dynamic to them that works itself out in the context of these competing.
Okay, so another thing I want to ask you about is in prison culture, you know, what about the gangs? You know, the system of the gang and how they have their own culture within prison, but they influence the prison culture quite a bit. And you being a former gang member, you know, what ways has your experience with both the gospel and gang life helped you understand a way that you can kind of talk to these guys and get them to see something different?
Well, you know, we talked about the adaptive culture of prison, and one of the primary ways that works itself out in the context of these power structures in prison is gangs. Now, for me, and I think for a lot of these guys who, you know, can kind of fall into that, there's two things they're looking for. Number one, they're looking for identity. And number two, they're looking for community. And so one of the ways in which, and I found that, you know, I found both an identity and a community in gangs. But the problem with that is the longer you're invested in that, the more overwhelmed and swallowed up you become and consumed by that identity. You're consumed and invested in a community that is not going to lead anywhere good. And so one of the counters that Christianity offers in terms of changing that, and to changing that, you change prison culture, is providing a different means for identity and a different means for community, really true community, because you and I both know, you've seen it, I've seen it, that the community that gang prison is, you know, it'll turn on somebody in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
You know, as long as the guy is identifying with the gang, as long as he is complicit in the rules and things associated with that community, as long as he's doing that well, then he's good. If they violate that in some way, it's like for
right.
And Christianity's not like that, man. It's a community. It's a true community. It's a community of love, and it offers a real true counter to what like pseudo community that gangs present down here. And I think for me, once I came to and faith in Christ, one of the first things I came to Christ at is administrative segregation, which means I'm living in a cell 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, as a result of my gang membership. I didn't have community center by myself. However, reading, you just read like the Pentecost narrative in Acts chapter 2, where, we put a lot of theological emphasis on, okay, well, what happens to the phenomenon when these people speak in tongues and all of this stuff here? Well, you look at what happens at Pentecost, the trajectory of the book of Acts, and it's all about how the gospel creates Christian community. And so I think that for Christianity, it creates a community, a true community, a community of love that is the most powerful counter to gang in the prison system.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that the prison culture is dominated by gangs today, or is it dominated by drugs?
Well, I think it's kind of a twofold thing, man, because you and I both know that a lot of times, the drug trade inside prison is controlled by gangs.
Yeah. I say this all the time. It's not about staying alive and joining a gang to protect each other. Now it's about staying alive in the figurative sense of having money. So gangs come together to experience an easier way of prison life by selling drugs and trafficking and whatever, so that they can have a better means of incarceration. And that's what I've witnessed as I was released from prison, that gangs so much, they came together not to protect each other, which is probably what they were originally designed for, or at least prison gangs, specifically the one you joined, came together to protect one another from getting killed and raped and all those, and beat by multiple of other people from other races or things. But nowadays it's all about just staying alive in the figurative sense, and just enjoying prison, the luxury of having money within the prison system. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, it's always about control. If you have the numbers and you have the power to control the contraband trade, drugs, everything that involves, which makes for, what we would say a better life down here.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, how they say taking penitentiary chances, right? The risk involved in all of that, man, ends up costing people a lot more than it pays out oftentimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's about control. Whoever can control the contraband trade controls the money.
Yeah.
And whoever controls the money typically, has the power, man. And that makes for a more comfortable living down here.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the message I preached one time was that in a parallel sense, prison, a lot of people get so caught up in doing time, which that's entailed like having some type of situation set up to where you're always high. You're always on like an illegal cellular phone, or you're on some kind of situation where your time is easier so much that you forget you're even doing time. I've even heard it where somebody's like, man, I'm so good right now, I don't even feel like I'm locked up. And I told myself, I said, when I was preaching this sermon, I was thinking about this. I said, man, that's exactly how Satan wants us to be in the kingdom of darkness. He wants us to be in this world. He wants us to be inside of Adam's prison right now, having so much fun, we forget we're even locked up. So we'll never desire to get released. And some people in prison, the physical prison, they're so caught up in doing time, they forget that the goal is to go home. and they catch more time. And now they're going to do, they start with a 10-year sentence and get a life sentence for having so much fun inside of that prison.
Yeah, like it ain't nothing.
Yep.
It's par for the course.
Well, Jason, so why such an emphasis on the word community in your book?
Well, I think because first and foremost, as Christians, we have this idea that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And, you have all these different views about what exactly constitutes the image of God and man. But however we parse that, we know that there's a relational aspect to the image of God and man, right?
Yes.
You think about the triune nature of God. There's an eternal relationship in the three persons of the Trinity between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right?
Yes.
And so as God's image bearers, we too, inherently are designed for relationship, for community, right?
Right.
And so we come to prison and, we're stripped of our identities. We're pulled from whatever community we was involved in the world. And so we have this natural, this ontological desire for community. And so we find that in illicit ways.
Yeah.
Primarily we find it in, gangs. You've seen it down here, people band together under the banner of all kinds of stuff, right?
Yep.
Form community. And so the emphasis on community is because, going back to this idea of changing prison culture, I think the real power structure that emerges kind of organically within prisons is the community of God's people and the community, the Christian community of the church that emerges down here that holds the real supernatural power to offset these illicit power structures and really accomplish the goal of the legitimate power structure, which is to help people rehabilitate, get back into the free world.
Yeah.
So that's the reason I emphasize community so much, is because I think that is the real vehicle through which positive moral change comes, so that we are in a better position that when we step out of this place, we know what community looks like. We find it out there, get plugged into a Christian community out there, and, we don't become isolated, come back to prison, we're successful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can attest to the prison culture that I was, in there, to out here. A lot of parallels exist that most people probably don't think about. But I'm a part of a Christian community out here, but it's real easy to not be a part of one. It's real easy to go to church every Sunday and Wednesday night and still not be a part of a Christian community. The only community you're involved with is maybe your neighbors or your friends at work. And in that community greatly influences you. And it may influence you to be negative. It may influence a negative behavioral form of change, of character. And so in prison, the same way, you can kind of isolate yourself or whatever, but ultimately whatever culture of community is, dominant in the society that you live in, prison is separate from that free world society. It's going to play a huge role if God's not playing a huge role. And it'll change you for the worst, or Christ will change you for the better. How did you use Christ and culture in your book? How did you weave him into what your conversation was about church inside of prison culture?
Yeah, well, so Beaver, is kind of the classical standard for understanding the relationship of Christ to culture. And so he has 5 types of Christ over culture, Christ against culture, Christ transforming culture. I can't remember off the top of my head the other two, but Niebuhr created these 5 types that try to understand theologically the
Gotcha.
So for me, if I was to, if I was to be pigeonholed into one of people's types, it would be, that Christ and his body, the church, is the real vehicle for the transformation of culture. So it would be kind of Christ transforming culture as far as one of Peter's types. But yeah, anytime, you're thinking about the relationship between Christ and culture, if you're not, if you haven't at least read Niebuhr, you're probably not thinking about a Christian relationship to culture.
Right.
In a well-rounded way.
Right. Yeah, I remember that book.
That's what Dr. Wilson would have told us anyway.
Oh man, I seen Dr. Wilsey on Facebook last night. I'm always shooting little messages to him. Dr. Presley too, but Presley don't talk back. He just reads my messages. How does Christian community contribute to changing prison culture?
Well, so you and I know, just based on, our conversion experience, right? That when a person comes to a saving knowledge of Christ and does something, to us, and while it is always emphasized that it is much as salvation is an individual thing, like Christ saves people, it's never individualistic, right?
Right.
He never saves us and leaves us by ourselves. He saves us into a community, into his body, right?
Right.
So, and I talk about it in the book about prison, in particular, the glass houses that you may be able to get away with something for a little while, but everybody pretty much knows your business.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knows what you're up to, and I remember talking about some of this material with a good friend of mine who's a pastor, in the world, and I asked him, I said, man, have you ever taken a shower with your worship pastor? And he looked at me like I had lost my mind. And I said, let me tell you about community inside, Christian community inside prison.
Yep.
I said, I was showering with my worship leader the other day talking about Augustine's view of the image of God in man.
Yeah.
Bro, there are no secrets. There are no secrets here, man. This is a glass house, and we have this intimate view of community that maybe is missed in some aspects.
Yeah.
In the free world, and I think maybe more closer to what we find in the Christian community in the New Testament in the early church, right? So when you have that type of relationship, that type of community where when you're messing up, a brother pulls up and says, "Hey man, you need to shave back, bro.
Yeah.
This is not what Christ has called you to. He's created us for good works. Encouraging people, holding people accountable." That type of community, man, and close-knit, tight-working community, fueled by the Spirit of God, man, has the power to change not just the penitentiary, but the world.
Yeah.
That's why, you see when Paul and Barnabas, they go into Iconium, I believe it was, when they said, man, here are these people who have turned the world upside down. They come among us as well, right? We have the power by the Spirit of God as the community of believers to transform any culture, not just prison.
Yeah. And I'm going to tell you, when I first got locked up, when I was first on the Gurney unit, I had a dorm I lived in, which was a kitchen dorm. We called it a 2-dorm. And we had some strong Christian brothers who just came back on bench warrant. They had a lot of time done in the system, very mature, older guys. And they're the ones that ultimately led me to Christ, not in the sense of like, here, let's say this prayer with me, but their lives and the community that they built around me, not necessarily for me, but the community I was a part of in that dorm. It was such a good, strong fellowship. I didn't even know, and still to this day, don't remember anybody else in the dorm except for the Christians in that dorm. And we were there for like 16 months. And I'm telling you, man, that was the first time I ever felt in, like, like I was inside of a community and a culture at the same time that greatly influenced and motivated me for change in my life. And it's what led me to Christ. And then we found that same experience in the seminary at Darrington. All of us, 40 of us was in the same class. We had 40 before us and 40 after us. And so each class had its own, particular friends and things like that. But I felt that community. That community was very, I don't want to say controlling, but influencing in our Christian change in our life. And so, when I read your book, I thought about that a lot. I thought about that Christian community that I've experienced and how refreshing it could be. We a lot of times we have the problem of change because we spend so much time outside of that community. And in prison, you don't really get that opportunity. You say a cuss word, people down. If you're a preacher, the people on the other side of the unit's going to know about 6:00 that night. They call it CNN, Christian Convict News Network. so yeah, that's exactly right. And that plays a major role. So if you had an advice for pastors coming into prison, based on your research in your book, what's one of the key things that you would want to tell those ministers that come into the prison? Now, before you say that, let me tell you what I want to tell them. Don't just preach the gospel message. People need the discipleship. People don't want to hear you practice when you come in to preach. These guys down here are not all dumb, stupid inmates that just need to hear an actual good word. They're getting good word. So they're getting words from field ministers that got college degrees. They're getting words from guys that spend all day, that live around them, that know that. What is something you can tell volunteers? Now, because there's a lot of amazing volunteers that come down. There's some that come down just to practice preaching. And they just preach a basic old gospel. Jesus died and rose again, which is fine. But we've been fed that milk for so long. We need some of that meat too. And so what are the ways that you think a volunteer that come into the prison as a missionary into the prison culture, what are ways that they can be most influential?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, man. And I talk about this a little bit in the book that, when you think about like the evangelical churches in particular, like from the 50s and 60s, Billy Graham and kind of his emphasis began to reach out into the prisons for these evangelistic enterprises. They come in and they preach a gospel message in hopes that somebody would receive Christ and receive salvation, and by that become changed and not have to worry about committing crimes ever again, right? Well, we all know that Charles Colton, the founder of Prison Fellowship, when he got out of federal prison after the Watergate scandal, he kind of placed more of an emphasis on these small group discipleship groups within prison itself.
Yeah.
And I think that for somebody coming in here to volunteer, I think that they need to recognize that Christian community, man, the church is here, right? The church is an organic thing, right? It's not necessarily an institutional thing. There is an aspect of the church that is institutional. It's an organic thing, right? It springs up naturally wherever the gospel is alive and well. And there is a Christian community in prison, so you're not coming in here figuring out how to get people saved. I think the primary emphasis should be on coming in here figuring out how to help cultivate what already exists here. And the way that works itself out is through, like you said, discipleship, helping people grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, strengthening the Christian community so that prisons can be changed for the better. Because, you think about the Texas prisons, that the goal of the agency is the positive moral rehabilitation of the people that are incarcerated or in custody in this prison, so that the public's safer when people get out of here, right? Well, the best way, bro, I've been doing this since 1996, and the greatest rehabilitative program or anything down here, man, is of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the hearts and minds of people in these places. Outside of that, man, your sheep dies on whether or not somebody's going to make it when they get out of here tonight.
Yeah, that's good. I just so happen to think about Paul. You know, part of his missionary journeys was to go to places that haven't heard the gospel. And when he went there, he developed that gospel there with them, you know, and he's shown them love the whole time. I mean, he wrote Corinthians, he was saying, you know, I pretended as the only thing I knew was Christ and Christ crucified. You know, but that was when the church, you know, hadn't existed yet. You know, he was helping to build that church. And so, but when he wrote the book of Romans, he was writing to already Christians. So he didn't write a gospel message that said, you know, Jesus died and rose again. You know, what did he write? He wrote one of the greatest theological letters of the history of the world. And he did that to disciple the Roman church there. And so, yeah, he's, you know, he's seen the need is not so much to just get them to hear the gospel just because he wasn't there to preach it, but that, you know, they already know the gospel. They've heard it all their lives probably and preached into them over and over again, especially in the prison context, amen. But what they needed was true discipleship, how to make Christianity look real. Not only that, but how and what Christianity looks like in the lives of believers while they're still on this earth. You know, that's a very important thing for, I believe, for any mentor or discipler. And so, yeah, you know, you have some pretty good pastors that have come in there. Greg Smith, is that his name? Pastor Smith?
Yep.
Yeah, Pastor Smith was, you know, very awesome man. I remember Doug Cheeves, you know, great man of God. There's been, you know, I can't remember everyone's name. It's been a long time since I've been there to see that. But I'll also mention my buddy Jason Anguiano, LBJ, Lawrence Burks Jr., and Jason Karch. You know what I mean? Like we know the needs of each other. We know what we struggle with, and we contribute to their change. You can't do that by just preaching. Now, preaching has its merits, and coming in and doing an amazing service and allowing people to have that moment of your message and your testimony, that's great. But man, when you get to know specific inmates and you specifically have an opportunity to be able to change who they are by getting to know them, that's a whole nother level.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Pastor Greg. Just over the course of 9 years, man, the way that he has poured into, you know, like me, Jesse, and LJ. But you know, just speaking for myself in particular, you know, his wisdom, you know, his counsel, you know, has shaped me in great ways in terms of navigating the Christian life on a day-to-day basis, being a better man of God, being a better brother, you know, to other Christians, you know, and all of that doesn't come through just preaching an evangelistic message. You know, that comes through discipleship. You know, walking this thing out on a day-to-day basis with, you know, with somebody. And I think that's the key for people who volunteer their time to come in here. You know, while true enough, you know, the gospel needs to be proclaimed.
Yes.
And, you know, like Paul says at the end of Romans, you know, he concludes Romans with now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel. We never, ever, ever get beyond the gospel.
That's right.
But at the same time, man, it's how it is the gospel is applied to our lives on a day-to-day basis for living for Christ wherever we're at. And that comes to discipleship.
That's right. Well, I appreciate you for spending time with me today, and I know
You
that
have 1 minute left.
I know that you know, I go through moments of partial grief. You know, to know that some of the people that I love the most, that I've come to be the strongest brothers with, are still left behind there. But I know that your voice is not less important because you're in chains.
it's just as important as the Pope's voice, in my opinion. And so I just want to make sure that those voices are heard.